$200,000. Emily's voice cracked as she read the bill aloud, her hands trembling over the kitchen table. She was only 28, fresh out of an emergency appendectomy, and now the hospital had buried her under a mountain of debt. Her insurance company's response, 3 cold words stamped across the claim: denied, not covered. I watched my daughter collapse into silence, her face pale, her breath short. A young teacher, already drowning in student loans, now told she owed more than she could earn in a lifetime. To her, it wasn't a bill. It was a death sentence, written in numbers. The kitchen was quiet, except for the rustle of paper. Outside, neighbors mowed their lawns and kids rode bikes. But inside our small Ohio home, the world had stopped. I reached across the table, pulled the letter from her shaking hands, and scanned the charges. $8,000 for a single injection, $12,000 for surgical supplies. 30 years as a nurse had taught me how hospitals inflate numbers, but never had I seen the system turn on my own child. Emily's eyes filled with tears. "Mom, I can't pay this. I'll lose everything." I placed my hand firmly over hers, the same way I used to steady frightened patients before surgery. "No, sweetheart, you won't lose everything, because I'm not letting them do this to you." What Emily didn't know, and what the hospital and insurance company had overlooked, was that I had been part of this system for 3 decades. I knew the codes, I knew the loopholes, and I knew exactly where to start pulling the threads. They thought she was just another patient number. They thought I was just another retired nurse. What they miscalculated was not the cost of surgery. It was the cost of underestimating a mother. Follow Family Stories collection so you won't miss how this fight against medical debt turns into something much bigger. Before the $200,000 bill arrived, Emily's life had been simple. Not easy, but simple. Emily was 28 years old, and she had always believed in modest dreams. She taught 2nd grade at a public school in Ohio, pouring her heart into lesson plans and after-school tutoring. Her students loved her often, leaving little drawings on her desk that said, "Best teacher ever." Her paycheck, however, told a different story. After taxes, student loan payments, and rent for a small 1-bedroom apartment near the school, Emily barely scraped by. She wasn't extravagant. No new car, no luxury vacations. Just a life of quiet routine where every dollar was stretched thin. Then, in the middle of one ordinary week, came the sudden stabbing pain in her abdomen. By the time her coworkers rushed her to the ER, her appendix had nearly ruptured. Surgery saved her life. But in America, saving a life often comes with a price tag attached. Susan, her mother, had been there through it all. 65 years old, widowed for nearly a decade, she lived on a nurse's pension and Social Security checks. For 30 years, she had walked hospital hallways, managing wards, comforting patients, and watching how the system worked from the inside. She had seen the tricks: extra charges, surprise fees, coding errors that shifted the burden onto patients. She had fought small battles for her patients before, but never imagined she would have to fight one for her own child. Susan and Emily were close, in a way only a mother, an only child, can be. When Susan lost her husband, Emily was just 20. Together, they held the household together, paying bills, grieving, and growing stronger as a team. Susan attended Emily's graduation from Ohio State University with tears in her eyes. She had worked double shifts back then to help pay tuition. Emily's dream of teaching children was Susan's proudest achievement. Their life was modest, even fragile, but it was theirs. Until that bill landed like a thunderclap on the kitchen table. The enemies came into focus quickly. The hospital, where somewhere in the chaos of the ER, Emily had been handed a clipboard and asked to sign forms. In her pain and panic, she scribbled her name without reading. Buried in that paperwork was language that allowed the hospital to tack on endless miscellaneous charges. The insurance company, which Emily had been faithfully paying every month, returned the claim stamped with "not medically necessary," as if an emergency appendectomy was optional. And the medical coder, an invisible figure behind a desk, who entered the wrong diagnosis code intentionally or carelessly, ensuring the claim would bounce back. A single line of numbers and letters had transformed a life-saving surgery into a debt trap. The wound cut deeper than numbers. Emily's eyes were hollow in the weeks that followed. She stopped bringing home little gifts from her students. She stopped talking about the field trip she had been planning. Every time the phone rang, she jumped, terrified. It was a debt collector already calling. One night, she whispered, almost too quietly, to hear Mom, "If I can't pay this, I'll lose my apartment. I might lose my job. Who's going to hire a teacher? Drowning in debt." Susan listened in silence, her own heart breaking. But beneath the grief, something harder began to form. She had spent 30 years in hospitals. She knew where the cracks were. And if the system thought it could swallow her daughter whole, it was about to choke. The day after the bill arrived, Susan began moving quietly, while Emily tried to keep teaching and hold her life together. Susan went into a different mode. She knew grief. She knew fear. But she also knew hospitals' paperwork in the shadowy corners where mistakes got buried. 30 years as a nurse had taught her one thing. The truth was never in the phone calls. It was always in the records. She started with the hospital's medical records department, requesting Emily's complete chart. Page after page came in heavy with abbreviations, codes, and signatures. She asked for the surgical report, the medication log, even the consent forms Emily had signed that night in the ER. At the kitchen table, she laid everything out in neat piles, her old nurse's eyes scanning like a detective. The consent form made her stomach turn. Emily's scrawl of a signature sat at the bottom, written in pain and panic, while nurses rushed her to surgery. Above it, buried in the fine print, were clauses that allowed the hospital to charge out-of-network rates, to bill separately for supplies, and to pass costs directly to the patient if insurance denial occurred. Susan had seen this language before. It was legal, yes, but it was also predatory. She knew she needed more. That was when she called Linda. Linda had been her closest colleague back in the days when they worked 12-hour shifts together. Now, Linda still worked at the same hospital, though in a different department. One evening, Susan met her in a quiet diner outside of town. Over coffee, she slid the records across the table. "Tell me what you see," Susan whispered. Linda read silently, then sighed. They didn't write everything down. Emily's appendix was perforated before surgery. There was contamination in the abdominal cavity. She should have been coded under a higher severity level, which insurance absolutely covers. But look, she tapped one line. They entered it as a simple appendectomy. That makes it look elective. That's why insurance denied it. Susan's jaw tightened. So they downcoded it? Linda nodded. Or miscoded it, depending on how generous you want to be. Either way, it's wrong. And I remember the surgeon arguing with the attending that night. He was worried about complications, but none of that made it into the report. The truth settled heavy between them. The hospital had hidden a complication, coded the surgery wrong, and then shrugged when insurance refused to pay. It wasn't just a mistake, it was a strategy. Susan thanked Linda and promised to protect her name. Driving home, she felt her grief harden into something sharper. Emily's hollow eyes, her whispered fear about losing her apartment, those images replayed as she sat back down at the kitchen table, spreading the records out again. She pulled out her old nurse's manual, flipping to the section on ICD codes. There it was, Carry 5.2, acute appendicitis with generalized peritonitis. That was the code that should have been entered. Instead, Emily's record showed K35.80, unspecified acute appendicitis. The difference wasn't just a few numbers. It was the difference between a fully covered emergency and a not medically necessary denial. Susan closed her eyes, pressing her fingers against her temples. She had trained young nurses to double-check codes. She had lectured interns about accuracy. And now, someone had either been careless or deliberately deceptive with her daughter's life. For days, she worked in silence, her kitchen transformed into a war room. Yellow highlighters marked the wrong codes. Sticky notes pointed to contradictions in the reports. She drafted timelines, cross-referencing Emily's symptoms with what the chart claimed. At night, she barely slept sipping cold coffee and rereading the records. Emily noticed, of course. One night, she came into the kitchen and saw the piles of paper. "Mom, what are you doing? This is too much. You can't fight them." Susan looked up, her eyes fierce. "I can, and I will. They're counting on us to give up. That's how they win." "But I know this system, Emily. I worked in it for 30 years. I know exactly where they cut corners." Emily hesitated, then whispered, "What if it doesn't work?" Susan took her daughter's hand. "Then at least we'll know we didn't let them bury you without a fight." When Emily went to bed, Susan sat alone in the quiet kitchen, surrounded by the weight of paper and silence. She thought about the hundreds of patients she'd seen over the years, families crying in waiting rooms, parents drowning in bills, people who signed forms they never understood. She had comforted them, but she had never had the power to change the system. Now, for the first time, she had a reason strong enough to try. She leaned back in her chair, whispering to herself, steady and cold, "Revenge isn't rage. It's patience. And I've been patient long enough." The evidence was ready. Every page highlighted, every code circled, every inconsistency marked with Susan's steady hand. When she picked up the phone to call the insurance company, she wasn't just a grieving mother, she was a nurse again, armed with knowledge, precision, and fury, sharpened into patience. She dialed the number on the denial letter. After minutes of hold music, a clipped voice answered, "Claims Department. How can I help you?" Susan's voice was calm, measured. "This is regarding claim number 84276. Patient, Emily Carter. Your company denied her appendectomy as not medically necessary. I am calling to inform you that your denial is based on an incorrect ICD code entered by the hospital. I have the medical records and the operative report in front of me." There was a pause. Then the voice said, "Ma'am, if you'd like to appeal, you'll need to fill out the formal—" "No." Susan interrupted her tone, steady but cold. "I'm not appealing. I'm reporting fraud. The hospital downcoded a perforated appendix to make it look elective. That is not an appeal. That is a misrepresentation of medical facts. If you deny this again, you will be complicit." The representative stammered, clearly unprepared. I'll escalate this to a supervisor." "Do that," Susan replied, and hung up. Within days, the case reached the desk of the ombudsman, the independent investigator assigned to handle disputes like this. Susan emailed every document, every highlighted code, every line of Linda's testimony. She knew how to write a report that couldn't be ignored. 30 years of charting had taught her how to make every word matter. Then she did something the hospital hadn't expected. She called the local news. Channel 5 News ran a nightly segment called Fighting for You. Susan sat in their studio, holding the bill in her hands, her voice steady as she told Emily's story. A young teacher, a life-saving surgery, and a $200,000 debt caused by a simple coding trick. The anchor looked into the camera, his voice grave. How many other families have faced the same nightmare? The story spread quickly. By the next morning, neighbors were texting Susan, shocked to see her on television. Parents at Emily's school rallied around her. Strangers online began sharing their own stories of medical debt. The pressure was building, and for the first time, the hospital and the insurance company were the ones on the defensive. At a hastily arranged press conference, a hospital spokesperson stood stiffly at a podium. "We take all allegations seriously. However, we believe this was a clerical error, not intentional wrongdoing." Susan stepped forward from the crowd, holding up a copy of the operative report. Her voice carried across the microphones. "A clerical error does not erase mention of a perforated appendix. A clerical error does not omit contamination notes. A clerical error does not consistently benefit the hospital financially while destroying a patient's life." The room went silent. Cameras clicked. The spokesperson's smile faltered. Later that week, the insurance company released a statement. "We rely on hospitals to provide accurate documentation. Based on the information we received, coverage was denied appropriately." But when Channel 5 ran a follow-up story, Susan produced Linda's sworn statement. On live television, the nurse's testimony was read aloud. The patient presented with perforation and peritonitis. Proper coding would have resulted in full insurance coverage. The insurance company's line crumbled. They had built their denial on hospital codes, but now the codes themselves were exposed as fraudulent. Their confidence turned to panic. At a closed-door meeting, executives from both the hospital and the insurance company sat across from Susan and her attorney. Their expressions shifted in visible stages, at first smug dismissal. "We have no obligation to revisit this case." Then nervous frowns as Susan slid document after document across the table. And finally, tight-jawed anger when the reporter's microphone appeared outside the door, reminding them the world was watching. Susan remained composed throughout her hands, folded her gaze unwavering. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The evidence spoke louder than anything she could say. When the hospital's lawyer tried to brush her off, she leaned forward and said, "You can't bury this with paperwork anymore. I know what you did. And now everyone else knows too." The silence that followed was the sound of power shifting. That night, back at home, Susan sat at the kitchen table with Emily. Piles of paper still surrounded them, but the weight had shifted. Emily's hands no longer trembled when she picked up the documents. She reached into a drawer and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "Mom," she whispered, handing it over, "I wrote this the night I thought I'd lose everything. I didn't know if you'd be able to fix it, but I knew if anyone could, it would be you." Susan unfolded the note and read aloud, her voice breaking for the first time in weeks. "Mom, if anyone deserves to fight for justice, it's you." The ripple began quietly. After Susan's story aired on Channel 5, other families started calling the station. A mother in Dayton, a retired veteran in Cleveland, a single father in Cincinnati. Each one carried their own thick stack of papers, their own story of insurance denials and impossible hospital bills. At first, the reporters thought these were coincidences. But soon, a pattern emerged: the same hospital system, the same insurance company, the same kinds of errors. Within a week, the phones at the insurance company were ringing off the hook. Angry policyholders demanded reviews of their claims. Some shouted at call center staff. Others broke down in tears, describing how they had sold their cars, their homes, their futures, just to pay bills that now looked suspiciously inflated. The company had trained its representatives to follow scripts. "We understand your frustration. Please file a formal appeal." But the script no longer worked. The voices on the other end of the line were too loud, too many. At the hospital, the fallout hit just as hard. Patients began arriving, not for checkups, but to demand copies of their medical records. Lines formed at the billing office. Clerks unaccustomed to confrontation trembled under the pressure. Local papers published headlines like "Hospital Faces Scrutiny" after $200K bill scandal. Then came the first public humiliation. The hospital's billing manager, a man who had been with the institution for 20 years, was forced to resign. Reporters caught him leaving the building with a cardboard box of personal items, his tie loose, his face pale. When asked for comment, he muttered, "No comment," before shoving past cameras. The image spread across social media. The man who once wielded power over thousands of patients' bills, now reduced to a symbol of failure. Next was the medical coder. Her name was buried in the records, but once the ombudsman released findings, the state licensing board got involved. The investigation revealed a trail of suspicious coding decisions, cases, where life-threatening complications were recorded as minor procedures. The board suspended her license indefinitely. She protested, claiming she was just following orders. But her colleagues whispered otherwise. She had been rewarded with bonuses for keeping denial rates low. Meanwhile, the insurance company faced its own reckoning. News broke that the state attorney general had launched an investigation into their denial practices. Overnight, their stock price plummeted. Investors panicked. Board members demanded answers. The CEO, once a confident figure in tailored suits, now appeared in front of Congress, beads of sweat glistening under the lights as lawmakers grilled him. Clips of the hearing went viral. One senator held up Emily's bill on live television and said, "This is not health care. This is highway robbery." The CEO stammered, "We are reviewing our processes." But his words sounded hollow against the rising tide of outrage. Inside, call centers, chaos reigned. The automated systems collapsed under the flood of complaints. Hold times stretched to hours. Desperate supervisors begged employees to work overtime, but many simply quit. One viral video showed a young employee crying at her desk, saying, "I can't keep telling people their lives don't matter." It was shared millions of times, fueling the narrative of a crumbling empire. Susan watched it all unfold from her kitchen table. Each headline, each resignation, each viral clip felt like another piece of justice being served, not just for Emily, but for every family that had suffered in silence. She didn't celebrate loudly. She didn't gloat. She simply sipped her coffee, marked another article, and whispered to herself, "It's working." For Emily, the change was even more profound. Her students' parents stopped her in the hallway to say they had seen her story, that they were proud of her. One mother said, "Because of you, I checked my own bills. They charged me twice for the same test. I never would have noticed if it weren't for your mom." Emily's eyes welled up, realizing that her private nightmare had become a public lifeline. The humiliation spread wider. The hospital's glossy brochures, once filled with slogans about trust and care, were mocked online. Memes circulated comparing their CEO to a thief in a lab coat. Protesters gathered outside the main building holding signs that read, "Patients, not profits." One evening, as Susan flipped through the news, Emily asked quietly, "Do you ever feel bad for them?" Susan looked at her daughter, then back at the television, showing angry crowds outside the hospital. Her voice was calm. No, they had years to treat people with dignity. They chose greed instead. This isn't cruelty, Emily. This is consequence. The system that once seemed untouchable was unraveling thread by thread. And with each thread pulled, the truth became harder to deny. The backlash came faster than Susan expected. For weeks, the tide had been turning in her favor. Headlines, protests, resignations, each day felt like another small victory. But powerful institutions do not collapse quietly. They fight back. It started with a letter, thick, official, delivered by certified mail. Susan opened it at the kitchen table, the same table where she had laid out all her evidence. Her eyes scanned the first lines, and her stomach tightened. Notice of pending litigation. The insurance company hereby demands a retraction of false statements made publicly by Susan Carter, including, but not limited to, allegations of fraud. Failure to comply will result in a lawsuit for defamation, damages not less than $1 million. Emily read over her mother's shoulder, her face draining of color. "Mom, they're suing you." Susan folded the letter carefully, her hand steadier than her heart. "They're threatening to. It's intimidation." But Emily was terrified. That night she sat on the couch, twisting her hands. "Maybe we should stop. We've already exposed them. People know the truth. What if they take everything from us? What if they drag you through court? I can't let them destroy you because of me." Susan wanted to reassure her, but in the quiet of her own mind, she felt the same fear. She was 65. She lived on a nurse's pension and Social Security. She had no fortune to fall back on, no army of lawyers at her disposal. A drawn-out legal battle could drain her dry. For the first time, she wondered if she had gone too far. At night, sleep slipped away. She sat in the darkened kitchen, staring at the mountains of paper that had once felt like weapons and now looked like chains. She thought about her late husband, about the years she had spent saving lives in hospital corridors. Was she strong enough to finish this fight? Or was she risking everything, including Emily's fragile peace, by pushing forward? Her doubts grew heavier each hour. The insurance company had resources she couldn't imagine. They could drag her name through the mud, call her a liar, paint her as a bitter old woman stirring trouble. The very people who had once cheered for her might turn away. Then one night, unable to quiet her thoughts, she rose from the table and walked into the living room. On the wall hung her framed nursing license, slightly faded, the gold seal still gleaming under the lamplight. Next to it was a plaque for Distinguished Service, Mercy General Hospital, 1989. She had almost forgotten it was there. Susan stood before those reminders of her past tears, stinging her eyes. She remembered the faces of patients she had held as they slipped in and out of consciousness. The nights she had run down hallways to catch a code blue. The families she had comforted when hope was all they had left. She remembered her oath, the one she had carried in her bones long after retirement. First, do no harm. Her voice broke into the silence, a whisper meant for herself. I've saved patients from dying. I've kept strangers alive. And now my own daughter is drowning in debt. Am I really going to stand by and watch her sink? She closed her eyes, inhaling deeply, and the weight inside her shifted. This was not just about one bill or one company. It was about every patient who had ever been betrayed by the system. It was about every mother who had ever sat in a kitchen like this, terrified of the next phone call. Susan wiped her tears, squared her shoulders, and returned to the table. She gathered the lawsuit notice, placed it in a folder marked Threats, and slid it aside. Then, she pulled out her evidence again, spreading it across the table with the same careful precision as a surgeon preparing instruments. Her hands were no longer trembling. Her mind was no longer clouded. The fear was still there, but beneath it burned something fiercer. Determination. She whispered into the quiet, the words steady this time. I've been in worse battles than this. And I didn't quit then. I won't quit now. And with that, Susan picked up her pen and began drafting her next move. The negotiation room was stark white walls, a long polished table, rows of chairs. On one side sat the hospital administrators and the insurance company's attorneys, their suits crisp, their faces drawn tight. On the other side, Susan and Emily. Between them, a stack of files worn at the edges from months of battle. The air was heavy with tension as the mediator entered. We are here to resolve the matter of Carter versus Valley Health and Premier Assurance, he announced. Both parties have agreed to a public negotiation to reach a binding settlement. The hospital's lawyer spoke first. His voice was smooth, but brittle. Our position is that this was an unfortunate clerical error, not intentional fraud. While we regret the distress caused, we maintain Susan cut in calm and steady. This was not an error. This was a choice that nearly ruined my daughter's life. The room fell silent. For a moment, no one met her gaze. Then the mediator gestured toward Susan. Please present your evidence. One by one, she laid out the documents. The operative report noting perforation. The coding manual highlighting the correct diagnosis. Linda's sworn statement. The denial letter stamped, not medically necessary. Each piece fit together like a puzzle that could no longer be ignored. The insurance attorney tried to object, but the mediator stopped him. The documentation is clear. His voice was firm. There is no basis for denial of coverage. Full payment is required. Emily's eyes widened, her breath catching. The words hung in the air like a bell tolling the end of a long nightmare. The mediator continued. In addition, given the public harm and distress caused, the hospital will issue a formal admission of error. The insurance company will not only cover the $200,000 bill, but also provide compensation for legal costs and damages to the Carters. The hospital lawyer's face flushed crimson. The insurance representative scribbled furiously on a notepad, whispering to his colleague. But the tide had turned. They had no defense left, no way to spin the truth. For Susan, victory did not come with cheers or applause. It came in the stillness of Emily's hand, gripping hers under the table, in the tears that welled silently in her daughter's eyes. It came in the knowledge that they had stood against giants and forced them to yield. But Susan wasn't finished. When the press conference ended and cameras crowded around her, she didn't speak only about Emily. She spoke about the families who had contacted her in whispers, the strangers who had sent her letters, the thousands who had shared their stories online. This fight was never just about one bill, she said into the microphones. It was about a system that preys on the vulnerable. It was about every mother, every father, every patient who has ever been told they don't matter. Today we proved that they do. The crowd erupted in applause. For once, Susan allowed herself a small smile. In the weeks that followed, Susan created a Facebook group called Medical Debt Fighters. What began as a handful of members quickly grew into hundreds, then thousands. Families uploaded their bills asking for help. Volunteers, former nurses, coders, lawyers joined in combing through line items, flagging suspicious charges, guiding people toward appeals. Emily watched in awe as her mother, once just a retired nurse living on a pension, became the leader of a movement. Teachers, veterans, single parents, they all found strength in the community Susan had sparked. And for the first time since her surgery, Emily stood in front of her class without fear hanging over her. She could teach again, smile again, dream again. Susan's kitchen table was no longer a battlefield of paperwork. It had become a hub of hope. Families mailed thank you notes. Strangers stopped her in grocery stores to say, "Because of you, I checked my bill. Because of you, I fought back." One evening, as Susan sat scrolling through the group page, Emily leaned over her shoulder. "Mom, you didn't just save me. You saved all of them." Susan reached over and squeezed her daughter's hand. "No, Emily. We saved each other, and we're not done yet." The inheritance Susan left her daughter was not measured in money or property. It was measured in strength, in courage, in a legacy of standing up when silence would have been easier. The debt had been erased, but something far more powerful remained: a community armed with knowledge, united by justice. And in that, Susan knew lay the true victory. The storm had passed. The bills were gone. The threats silenced, the settlement signed. But for Susan, the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of memory, of lessons, of a kind of peace she had not known in months. She often found herself sitting in the living room at dusk, the golden light stretching across the carpet, her tea cooling in her hand. Emily would be at school, laughing with her students, free from the shadow that had once hung over her. And in those quiet hours, Susan reflected on what had happened. "I didn't win because of hate," she murmured one evening, almost to herself. "I won because I understood the system, because I refused to let them crush my daughter beneath it." It wasn't anger that had carried her through those long nights at the kitchen table. It wasn't vengeance that had guided her pen across every highlighted code. It was love, steady, patient, unyielding. The kind of love that outlasts exhaustion, that sharpens into courage when everything else fades. She thought back to her years as a nurse. The long shifts, the rushing hallways, the whispered prayers over patients who hovered between life and death. Back then, victory meant a pulse, returning a breath, drawn, a family reunited. This battle had been different, but the essence was the same. Protect the vulnerable. Stand between the powerless and the ones who would harm them. Susan realized something else too. The system had counted on silence. Hospitals, insurance companies, coders, they all relied on the fact that most people wouldn't fight. Most would accept the bill, swallow the debt, carry the shame. But once silence was broken, once truth was spoken aloud, the facade cracked. And through that crack, light poured in. For Emily, the lesson was just as profound. She had seen her mother transform from a retired nurse into a warrior of patience and persistence. She had watched justice rise, not like a sudden storm, but like a slow tide, steady and undeniable. One evening after dinner, Emily sat with her mother, her voice soft. "I always thought justice was something that just happened. Like the law would protect us, the truth would be enough. But now I see it doesn't come unless someone fights for it." Susan nodded gently. "Justice isn't automatic, Emily. It's work. It's courage. And sometimes it takes patience longer than you think you can endure." Emily leaned her head on her mother's shoulder, a small smile curving her lips. "I guess I learned patience from the best." Susan chuckled softly, her hand resting over her daughter's. "Then promise me you'll pass it on. Don't let fear or doubt silence you. Not ever." The house was quiet, but the quiet felt different now. It was no longer the silence of fear, but of peace earned through struggle. Susan knew she hadn't just won back her daughter's freedom. She had shown Emily and perhaps countless others that strength does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers steady and firm, "I will not be moved." And in that whisper lay the heart of everything she had fought for. Susan had always kept a habit of writing in a small leather-bound journal. It began years ago, when she was still a nurse, jotting down shift's notes about patients, even stray thoughts after a long day. During the months of the battle with the hospital and the insurance company, the journal had filled with names, codes, dates, fragments of fury, written in her neat, steady hand. Now with Emily safe and the debt erased, Susan turned back to those pages, flipping through memories of exhaustion and determination. Then she opened to a fresh sheet and began again, not to record her own pain, but to leave words for those who would come after. If you are ever buried under medical bills, you do not understand, do not be silent. Ask questions. Demand explanations. Do not let the system intimidate you. Every number can be checked. Every code can be challenged. And remember, you are not alone. There are others who will stand with you. She wrote deep into the night, her words steady, her purpose clear. This journal was no longer just hers. It was becoming a guide, a map for anyone who might face what Emily had faced. Meanwhile, Emily had begun to heal, not just physically, but emotionally. She returned to her classroom, her laughter spilling down the hallways, her eyes no longer clouded with fear. But she didn't leave the fight behind. In the evenings, she joined her mother online, logging into the Facebook group that had grown into a small movement. Susan would sit at her old computer, its keys worn smooth by years of use, scanning uploaded bills from strangers across the country. Emily would sit beside her with her laptop, helping translate codes, writing messages of encouragement. Together they answered questions late into the night. What does this charge mean? How do I file an appeal? Where do I even begin? Emily soon found her voice within the group. She began sharing their story, not as a victim, but as a survivor. She wrote posts that started with, "When my bill came, I thought my life was over. But here's what my mother taught me." Hundreds responded, thanking her for her honesty, drawing strength from her resilience. And so the torch passed quietly, naturally, from mother to daughter, from one battle won to many still to come. The old computer in Susan's kitchen became a symbol. Its screen flickered, its fan whirred loudly, but it held within it every file, every highlighted record, every message sent to families desperate for help. It was no longer just a machine. It was a weapon against fear, against silence, against injustice. One evening, Emily placed her hand on the computer tower, smiling softly. "This is where it started, isn't it? Right here at this table." Susan nodded. "Yes. This old thing helped us fight back. It kept every record safe, every truth intact. Maybe one day," Emily said thoughtfully, "we should donate it. Put it in a museum about healthcare reform. Call it the machine that fought back." Susan laughed, a warm, tired laugh. "Maybe we will. But for now, it still has work to do." The fight was not finished. There would always be another family, another bill, another denial. But Susan no longer feared the weight of that truth. She had carried her daughter through the storm, and now she had shown Emily how to carry others. The torch had been passed not with fanfare, not with ceremony, but with love, patience, and the click of old keys in a quiet Ohio kitchen. And that, Susan thought, was the most powerful inheritance of all. In the end, the bills were cleared, the threats withdrawn, and justice restored. Yet what began with a single envelope on a kitchen table had grown into something far greater than one mother's fight for her daughter. Susan, at 65, had never set out to change the system. All she wanted was to protect Emily. But through patience, persistence, and love, she had done more. She had proven that silence is not the only option, that when truth is spoken, even the strongest walls can crack. Her living room no longer looked like a battlefield. The papers were gone, the highlighters put away. What remained was quieter, but infinitely stronger. A journal filled with lessons, a community bound by courage, and a daughter who now carried the flame forward. Emily often told her students, "My mother taught me that the quietest people sometimes fight the hardest battles." And Susan, hearing those words, knew the torch had been passed. This story did not end in anger. It ended in resolve. Resolve that hospitals cannot hide behind paperwork, that insurance companies cannot erase lives with a stamp of denial, that patience wielded with love can move even the coldest systems. In a country where medical debt can destroy entire lives, a 65-year-old mother proved that patience and love can bend even the system itself. And now the question is no longer for Susan, nor for Emily. The question is for you. If it were you, faced with a $200,000 bill caused by someone else's error, would you stay silent and pay, or would you stand up? The story lingers. The choice, as always, remains yours. Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to follow Family Stories Collection for more revenge tales. Emotional, powerful, and deeply real.